So I finally got around to seeing Halloween. I actually saw it 5 days after Halloween. That's how cool I am. This new movie ignores all the other Halloween films besides the original, which is good for me since the only other one I've seen is part 3 and that had nothing to do with anything. I'm sure a lot of you know by now that the killer's mask is actually a William Shatner mask painted white. And so I went into this Halloween wanting the killer to be William Shatner himself. He would be wearing a mask of his own face. No one would suspect him if he was wearing a mask of his own face. It would make him an evil genius.
Can we get tattoos? I want to get one of my face on my face. It'll be like I'm wearing a mask and the mask is me.
I guess to start with I should tell you what I thought about the original film, as that will reflect on my thoughts of the new one. So John Carpenter is one of my favourite directors. All of his films have minor flaws, but the presentation and experience he creates is phenomenal. He's a master craftsman when it comes to atmosphere and tension. But despite that, I'd never watched the original Halloween up until 3 weeks ago when I watched it for the first time. And if I'm honest, I was really disappointed. Blasphemer! And I actually feel a bit guilty about saying that. I understand the film had a tiny budget and was a product of its time, but it just didn't resonate with me in the way I think it was supposed to, and it's been so hyped up over the years. It also doesn't help that over the decades I've seen so many clips of this film, it took a lot of the impact out of it for me. I felt like I'd seen so much of it before, and that's not just from clips of the actual movie. The original Halloween has been imitated so many times, watching it for the first time now doesn't feel fresh. What was innovative for its time are now standard cliches in the horror genre. I didn't like many of the characters. The dialogue between the teenagers was inane and dull, and their acting wasn't very good at all. With that said, I really liked Donald Pleasence. His character was what got me through the film, and his performance was great. I love the part near the beginning of the film where he's in a car talking to a nurse and everything outside was complete darkness. I also enjoyed the score, which was done by John Carpenter, and the breathing sound effect when the killer was close was a nice touch. But when thinking about this film, I was surprised how little I enjoyed it. This was only 2 years before John Carpenter made The Fog, and only 4 years before The Thing. Alien came out only a year after Halloween. My plan is to revisit this film again at some point to see if I change my mind over time. I'd like to know what I'm missing, but my initial thoughts of the original were that it was underwhelming. So going from the original, my expectations for the new entry were low. And then I found out it was produced by Blumhouse, who make no end of crappy horror movies, and so my expectations sunk even lower. In some ways, you could call this a soft remake. It has the same basic structure and story beats as the original, and a number of characters are clearly replacements for ones from the first movie. But just because this new film actively points out that these new characters are obvious replacements of the originals doesn't mean the movie gets a pass. But in the third act, they invert things from the original. You could make the argument a lot of it is fan service, and while I wouldn't exactly disagree, it didn't come off that way to me. There were clear references, sure, but it never felt like if you didn't catch them, you'd be missing out. And it was never forced, distracting or pandering in the way something like Jurassic World was. It takes key scenes from the original and flips them around, and while I wouldn't call it clever, it's certainly not dumb. By far the best thing in the new movie was that they brought John Carpenter back to work on the score. They didn't overuse the central theme like you would expect. All of the music felt organic to what was happening. There's one part that I absolutely loved in the movie. Imagine a killer has escaped and you're hiding on a bus. Someone is nervously walking around with a gun, checking the area is safe. The logical thing would be to calmly say, "Please don't shoot, I'm unarmed. I'm going to come out from behind the seat slowly with my hands up." Well, in the film it goes like this. "Don't shoot!" It was the funniest thing I've seen in ages. If someone has a gun, don't jump out at them screaming "don't shoot." That kept me laughing all the way through the boring parts of the movie. The filmmaking was done to a decent enough standard, but it wasn't well written. There's a number of inconsequential characters that they dedicate a fair amount of screen time to. I understand what they were trying to achieve. They give them lines of dialogue, so when there's a chance they could die, you feel bad for them. But the writing is a bit dumb and it doesn't work at all. It feels like they're just wasting time, and it drags on for several minutes. What they're talking about is just bizarre. It has nothing to do with the film story, nothing to do with any of the main characters. It's just this perfunctory dialogue about wanting to dance or what they're having for dinner that takes up screen time for no reason. Perhaps it was trying to be funny, but if it was, it failed. Except for that one kid that was babysitting somewhere in the middle of the film. He was funny, but he didn't really fit in the film. I think it's a great idea for them to have a tiny bit of dialogue so the audience can easily empathise with them, but it should have been focused. They should have talked about the events of the film in some way. Have one of the guys say he knew one of the victims of the original murders, or he knew someone who worked as a doctor on Michael Myers. You know, just something to bring the attention back to the narrative of the movie. The film had the makings of a good horror movie, but the director isn't skilled enough in this genre to pull it off, which resulted in it feeling very unfocused. There were long drawn out tracking shots, and at one point a whole scene was done in one take. It was very much in the John Carpenter style and it was fantastic. But then there's other parts where people are talking and there's loads of quick edits. Characters are set up and then dropped out of the movie with no payoff, and they have a scene at a high school dance which is the exact same scene I just saw in Goosebumps 2. They were identical. One thing that surprised me about Halloween was just how tame it was. The entire film lacked any sort of atmosphere. It wasn't scary at all. There was no tension or suspense. The blood and gore felt like it was added in because that's what people expect from a modern horror movie, and it was pretty mundane. With a few edits, you could probably get this down to a PG-13 rating, and I don't think it would have any adverse effects on the movie as a whole. They did tease one horrible thing happening, but then failed to follow through with it. And that's not to say I wanted the film to do it, it would have been horrific. But the fact they tease it and then don't follow through just left me questioning why they even set it up to begin with. However, I did like that quite often you never saw the actual kills. It would have been easy for them to make a spectacle of the death scenes, but instead they show you the aftermath, and it gave Michael Myers this ghostly quality. He's just passing through this town leaving dead bodies in his wake. In this movie, Michael kills randomly and without reason, which I think was a good choice. In theory, it makes him a bit more menacing because you don't know where he's going to pop up next. And if it wasn't for the film's predictability and lack of tension, it probably would have worked. But the random nature of the killings doesn't lend itself well to a strong story. And in places the film was sorely lacking in any sort of narrative to maintain my interest and carry it forward. But whenever I got bored, I just entertained myself by thinking back to that part earlier in the movie. Don't shoot! Laurie Strode, the survivor from the original movie, is now obsessed with being prepared for when the killer returns. She lives in the middle of nowhere in this house that she's kitted out like she's the world's biggest fan of Home Alone. She's got all these guns and a big security system, and I couldn't help but ask how she could afford it all. I loved how Laurie is obsessed with Michael Myers, but he doesn't care about her at all. The events from the first movie have impacted every aspect of her life, but she means nothing to him and he just goes about killing at random. It's great, but to that end, the story needs to force these characters together for the climax, and so you have to go through a contrived series of events just to get certain characters in certain places at a certain time. It wasn't awful. And if you don't notice the only reason a particular subplot is there is to get one character from A to B, I'm sure it won't bother you at all. I enjoyed how the movie explored the effects a traumatizing experience can have on people, even if they only really did it in passing. Some of the characters act dumb, but in fairness the film does develop that these characters aren't ready to deal with the danger. They're unprepared and weak both mentally and physically. Likewise, they develop how Laurie is hell-bent on revenge, so I guess it's not in her personality to call the police for help when you have Michael trapped in the house, but it's odd one of the more regular characters doesn't suggest it. Maybe they don't have a landline. The movie has a lack of attention to details in some parts, and don't get me wrong, if they would have handled these details better, it wouldn't have improved the overall experience much, because the presentation of the film was lacking in a few areas, but it's kind of distracting to people like me who pay attention to these things. However, fixing these small details would have been nice. For example, a character is fleeing from the killer and bumps her head. She stops trying to get away to clutch her head and she screams as if she's just been hit by a meteorite. It was just a soft knock on the noggin. Sure, if you were in a regular situation, it'd hurt a bit, like if you bumped your head on a cupboard door, but when you're being chased by a killer and your adrenaline is pumping, you're not even going to feel it. I think whether or not you'll enjoy this movie hinges on the question, will you find it scary? I've said many times before, a horror movie doesn't have to be scary in order to be a good film, but in the case of Halloween, I think it's quite important. If you find it scary, it means the movie is working on you in the way that's intended, and you'll likely be able to overlook the weaker elements. You'll be absorbed into the film and gain a level of immersion that would otherwise be absent. I personally never found it scary at all. I found it lacked any tension or suspense, which resulted in me not being immersed in the film and the problems became more apparent. If you chopped the film into parts, a lot of them worked quite well in isolation. They certainly put some thought into lighting and shot composition, the acting was competent, although I would like to point out Judy Greer played the exact same character she played in Jurassic World. But when you take the movie as a whole, it doesn't hang together very well. The film is definitely better than I was expecting, but like I said earlier, I had rock bottom expectations. I also think part of my problem comes from that I'm not overly fond of the slasher subgenre. And on top of that, I was shamefully unimpressed by the original.
Shame. Shame.
I keep flip-flopping between what I thought about the overall experience. Sometimes I think it wasn't very good, sometimes I think it was average, and sometimes I think it was enjoyable. I feel like I'm being a bit more negative than the movie perhaps deserves. The film is close to being good. If only the tension worked. If it was scary, all of its shortcomings could be forgiven. After the film finished, I walked out thinking I was entertained enough. It didn't feel like I wasted my time, but the key point is I wanted to enjoy it more than I actually enjoyed it. Halloween suffers from a severe lack of tension and atmosphere. Its predictability really hurts the overall experience, but some of it is quite solid and could have made a good horror if it wasn't held back by its weaker elements. Like I said, I didn't think much of the original, but if you're a fan of that, I could see you enjoying this new installment a lot more. I'd rate this a 4 out of 10, maybe a 5. It's so close to being good, but just misses the mark for me. I will say, if you find yourself interested in this movie, you should definitely give it a try. It does seem like I'm an outlier in terms of my feelings towards the film. I think this is a case of I just don't get it. I'd love to hear what your thoughts of the film are. It appears people like it and the film is enjoying a decent amount of success. Despite my personal feelings on the movie, I'd still recommend it. I think what I'll do is watch this again at some point along with the original. I want to enjoy them, but I'm just missing something. And with that I'll say thank you for watching, I really appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Don't shoot!